Imagine renting a peaceful lake house for a relaxing weekend, only to realize you are not alone. The whispers at the dock, the reflection that shouldn't exist, and the screams from the water. These are not just stories, but real experiences. People have vanished, voices have been heard, and some say the lake itself is cursed. Tonight, we dive into 3 terrifying true lake house horror stories. And by the end, you might never look at a lake the same way again. Story number 1. The Whispering Docks. The cabin stood at the edge of Lake Lanier, its wooden frame weathered by decades of wind and rain. The lake itself was a vast, shimmering expanse, its surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. To most, it was a place of beauty, a tranquil retreat from the chaos of the world. But to those who knew its secrets, it was a place of darkness, where the line between the living and the dead blurred. Jake and Hannah had rented the cabin for a weekend getaway. They needed a break from the noise of the city, and the lake seemed like the perfect escape. But as they stepped out of their car and onto the gravel driveway, Hannah felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Jake replied, grabbing their bags from the trunk. "Like someone's watching us," Hannah said, her eyes scanning the trees that surrounded the cabin. Jake chuckled. "You're just spooked because of all those ghost stories about the lake. Relax, babe. It's just us out here." Hannah forced a smile, but the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The cabin was cozy, with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a large window that overlooked the lake. As the sun set and darkness crept in, the atmosphere grew heavier. The wind outside carried faint, indistinct whispers, and the firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls. At exactly 2 a.m., a loud, jarring knock echoed through the cabin. Hannah jumped, her wineglass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake stood up, his heart racing. "Probably just an animal or something. I'll check it out." "Don't open the door," Hannah pleaded, clutching his arm. "It's fine," Jake said, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. He grabbed a flashlight and approached the door. The knocking came again, louder this time. Jake hesitated, then yanked the door open. There was no one there. The beam of his flashlight swept across the porch and the dock, but the area was empty. The lake was eerily calm, its surface reflecting the pale moonlight. "See? Nothing to worry about," Jake said, trying to sound reassuring. But as he turned to close the door, Hannah screamed, "Jake, look!" He spun around, and his blood ran cold. Standing on the water, just a few feet from the dock, was a woman. Her long, tangled hair clung to her pale face, and her clothes were soaked, as if she had just climbed out of the lake. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and her mouth moved as if she were whispering something, but no sound came out. Jake slammed the door and locked it, his hands shaking. "What the hell was that?" Hannah cried, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice barely audible. "But we're not opening that door again." The next morning, the couple ventured out of the cabin, their nerves still on edge. The lake looked peaceful in the daylight, but the memory of the previous night's encounter haunted them. They decided to visit the local caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, who lived in a small house nearby. When they told him what they had seen, his expression turned grim. "You saw her, didn't you?" he said, his voice low. "Who?" Hannah asked, her stomach churning. Mr. Thompson sighed. In 1958, a woman named Eleanor drowned in the lake. Her body was never found. Some say she was pushed. Others say she jumped. But ever since, people have reported seeing her, standing on the water, whispering to anyone who'll listen. "Why does she appear?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. Some say she's looking for her killer. Others think she's trying to warn people about the lake. Either way, it's best to stay away from the water at night. Determined to uncover the truth, Jake and Hannah began researching Eleanor's story. They visited the local library, where they found old newspaper articles about her disappearance. According to the reports, Eleanor had been a young woman in her 20s, known for her beauty and her love of the lake. She had vanished one night after a party at a nearby cabin, and her body was never recovered. But as they dug deeper, they discovered something even more chilling. Eleanor's diary, which had been found in the cabin after her disappearance, contained entries about strange occurrences, shadows moving on their own, whispers in the night, and a growing sense of dread. The final entry was the most haunting. "They're here. They've found me. I can't escape." That night, the whispers returned, this time inside the cabin. The temperature dropped, and the fire in the fireplace flickered and died. Hannah clutched Jake's arm as the faint, indistinct murmurs grew louder. Then, the knocking started again. "Jake, we need to leave," Hannah begged, her voice trembling. Before he could respond, the door creaked open on its own. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor, her glowing eyes. Story 2, The Drowned Man's Reflection. Bear Lake, Utah, was a place of breathtaking beauty, its turquoise waters shimmering under the sun like a jewel nestled between towering mountains. The lake was a popular spot for fishing, boating, and camping. But for David and his friend Mike, it was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. They had rented an old lake house, a rustic but charming place with a large balcony that overlooked the water. The moment they arrived, David felt a strange unease, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The air was too still, the silence too heavy, as if the lake itself were holding its breath. The house itself was a relic of another time, its wooden frame weathered by decades of wind and rain. The front porch creaked under their footsteps, and the windows were streaked with grime, but the view of the lake made up for it. The water stretched out before them, its surface glistening in the afternoon sun. "Not bad, huh?" Mike said, tossing his bag onto the couch. "This place has character." David forced a smile. "Yeah, character. That's one word for it." They spent the rest of the day unpacking and setting up their gear. Mike was in high spirits, cracking jokes and planning their fishing trip for the next day, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The stillness of the lake unnerved him, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant bird. As the sun set and darkness crept in, the atmosphere grew heavier. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, indistinct whispers of the lake. David tried to ignore it, chalking it up to his imagination, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. That night, they sat on the balcony, drinking beer and swapping stories. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the water. For a while, it felt like old times, just the two of them, laughing and reminiscing. But as the hours dragged on, David grew restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. At around 2 a.m., David woke up to the sound of faint splashing. He lay in bed for a moment, listening, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was soft, almost rhythmic, like footsteps in the water. He glanced over at Mike, who was snoring softly in the other bed, and decided to investigate. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the balcony, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the lake. At first, everything seemed normal. The water was calm, the surface smooth as glass. But then, he saw it. In the water, there was a reflection of a man. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. He looked around. No one was there. The balcony was empty, and the shoreline was deserted. Yet, the reflection remained, moving slightly, as if walking underwater. The man's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken. He wore tattered clothes that floated around him like seaweed, and his movements were slow, deliberate. David's mind raced. Was this some kind of trick? A hallucination? He rubbed his eyes, but the reflection didn't disappear. Instead, it grew clearer, more detailed. And then, the worst part. The reflection's eyes locked onto his. David stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. He screamed for Mike, his voice breaking with panic. Mike burst onto the balcony, his hair disheveled and his eyes wide with alarm. "What's wrong? What happened?" David pointed a shaking finger at the lake. "There's someone out there, in the water." Mike grabbed the flashlight and shone it across the lake, but the surface was empty. The reflection was gone. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Mike asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "I know what I saw," David insisted, his voice trembling. Story 3. The screams from the water. The lake house had been in Mark's family for generations. Perched on the edge of Lake Superior in Michigan, it was a place of stark beauty and haunting isolation. The vast, icy waters stretched endlessly, framed by rugged cliffs and dense forests. For Mark, it was a place of fond memories, summer barbecues, fishing trips, and evenings spent by the fire. But for his young daughter, Sophie, it was a place of nightmares. Every time they visited, Sophie complained about hearing screams from the water at night. "Dad, I heard it again," she would say, her voice trembling. "It sounds like someone's drowning." Mark always brushed it off. "It's just the wind, sweetheart. Or maybe the loons. They can sound pretty eerie at night." But Sophie insisted, "No, Dad, it's people. They're screaming for help." Mark would reassure her, tuck her back into bed, and tell her it was just her imagination. But deep down, he couldn't shake the unease that crept into his chest every time she brought it up. It was a cool summer evening when Mark and Sophie arrived at the lake house. The air was crisp and the sky was clear, the stars reflecting off the calm surface of the lake. They spent the day unpacking and settling in, and by nightfall, Sophie was fast asleep in her room. Mark sat by the fireplace, a book in hand, enjoying the quiet. But as the hours passed, the silence grew heavier. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of waves lapping against the shore. At exactly 3 a.m., Mark woke up to the sound of screams. They were loud, agonizing, and unmistakably human. Desperate, pleading voices cried out for help, their echoes bouncing off the cliffs. Mark's heart raced as he bolted upright. He glanced at Sophie's room, relieved to see her still asleep. Grabbing a flashlight, he ran to the shore, his breath visible in the cold night air. The lake was eerily calm, its surface smooth as glass. The screams had stopped, leaving only the sound of the wind. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice trembling. Is anyone there?" There was no response. Just as he started to turn back, he saw something. A hand emerged from the water. Then another. It looked like someone was being pulled down by something unseen. The hands thrashed wildly, fingers clawing at the surface before disappearing beneath the waves. Mark stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. He ran back to the house, his heart pounding, and locked the door behind him. The next morning, Mark decided to visit the local historian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson. She listened to his story with a grave expression. "You're not the first to hear those screams," she said, her voice low. "Back in the 1800s, a ship called the Lady of the Lake sank in these waters. Over 200 people died, and their bodies were never recovered." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think?" Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Some say their spirits are still trapped here, reliving their final moments. They scream for help, but no one can save them." That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring out at the lake, his mind racing. The screams returned, louder and more desperate than before. Sophie woke up, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad, they're back." Mark held her close, his heart breaking at the terror in her voice. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're leaving first thing in the morning." As they packed their things, Mark glanced at the lake one last time. The water was calm, but he knew the truth. The screams would never stop. Years later, Mark heard that another family had bought the house. The next morning, they were gone, their belongings left scattered on the shore. The screams of the Lady of the Lake still echo across the water, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that lies beneath the surface.